Welcome everyone to the New York Alternative Investment Roundtable September virtual event, The State of Play in U.S. Politics. I'm Ali Tocco, the president of the Roundtable, and we're glad you're able to join us today. To kick off, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Roundtable sponsors. I think you can see them on the screen. We're very thankful to have such a wonderful group of actively involved sponsors from within the industry. And if you've not participated in one of our virtual events before, I'd like to draw your attention to the Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. You can use this function to ask questions of our speaker, which we encourage you to do. And particularly this speaker would really like to hear from you, so please don't be shy about logging in your questions. Today's speaker is someone who almost doesn't need an introduction. We are honored to have former New York Governor George Pataki, who currently serves as senior counsel at Norton Rose Fulbright, where he focuses on environmental, energy, and infrastructure law. He is also a founder and chairman of the Pataki Cahill Group, a consulting firm that mainly advises on climate change, energy, and the environment. As most of you already know, Governor Pataki served as a governor of New York for 3 terms, from 1995 to 2006. His time as governor was defined by his strong stewardship of the state, particularly in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, and his work with both President Bush and Mayor Giuliani and other officials to lead and aid in the city's recovery. He was also instrumental in the redevelopment of the World Trade Center, having appointed half of the Port Authority commissioners and a majority of the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation members who helped determine the site's future. Today's discussion will be moderated by Robert Akeson. Robert is the co-head of prime brokerage for Moraes Asset Securities. Robert has extensive experience managing prime brokerage, capital introductions, agency execution, and research distributions along his long and industrious career. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Robert.
Well, thank you, Ali, and welcome everyone to the September call, and a special welcome to Governor Pataki. Governor, we live in interesting times, don't we? And we can think of probably few people who are better positioned, better informed to share their thoughts on where we are. And I know we have a lot of topics to cover here and not a great deal of time. So maybe a good way to start would be to ask you to give us a few minutes of your perspective of where we are in this election cycle. Obviously, a lot's going on, but on that note, Governor, please take the floor.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you for having me on. And Ali, thank you for that kind introduction. And let me just do an advertisement, since this is the Alternate Investment Roundtable. My wife and I are looking to sell 50 cows, if any of you are looking for a way out of alternate investment. That's an aside. Don't worry about it. I'm just in a lighthearted mood. But then, Robert, you asked me to talk about politics, and that kind of changes everything, because these are not exactly lighthearted times when you look at the political situation. You said these are strange times. I think this is the most bizarre year of my lifetime. So many things that have never happened before going on in the country. And now, where the attention will be focused, if it hasn't already been there, is today we are 7 weeks away from the election. Now, I say that because always there was an election day. This year, as strange as it is, I believe today in Pennsylvania, people can begin voting. And I'm not so sure that's the wisest policy, to let people vote before they've seen the candidates debate or any of the other interaction that hopefully will occur between now and November. But looking at the big picture here on the election, I'm going to make a bold prediction. 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton was going to win. Today, Joe Biden is going to win. And I say that with exactly the same certainty that 4 years ago I said Hillary Clinton was going to win. And what that means is that for all the experts, for all the polls out there, between now and November 3rd, anything can and might happen. If you look at the polling, Biden is slightly ahead of where Hillary was in the key states 4 years ago, but those numbers are really closing fast. The election is becoming much closer. And for someone to make a prediction with any certainty today would just be a terrible mistake. Because just as in March, it looked like the president would get reelected easily, and then COVID out of the blue came and completely changed the nature of our country for the moment. And then over the course of the summer, Black Lives Matter became the issue, and that was something that wouldn't have been predicted in March. And now the horrific assaults on police officers, like what we saw this weekend in Compton, has become a very important issue. And each of these changes the paradigm of the election campaign enormously. So I think there's one thing to me that is absolutely certain, and that is that the debates are going to have the most important impact on an election we have ever seen. There are 3 scheduled debates. The candidates aren't engaged out on the hustings as much because Joe Biden is being protected. Trump is just beginning to get back out there. But I'm humble enough to know that when I ran for governor the first time, people didn't stand up and jump up and down and say, "I'm voting for Pataki. He's a great guy." No one knew who I was. But what they did know is that they did not like my opponent, Mario Cuomo. And during the course of that campaign, what I had to do is convince enough New Yorkers that I was an acceptable alternative, that they would give me a chance. And I think that's very analogous to where we are in the election today. Trump has his 45% of supporters. They're going to vote for him, as he said 4 years ago, if he shot someone in the middle of Times Square at noon. They're going to vote for him. But he doesn't have enough votes to win the election today. All Joe Biden has to do is convince the American people that he has the energy, the mental capacity, and the ability to govern the country and to stand up to the Democratic left.
So, Governor, if I can just jump in with a question here. To go back to the beginning of your statement about what seems like, what the likely outcome might be. You mentioned how the election took shape in 2016 and how it seems to be following, and I'm inferring this from your statement, a similar pattern. What I'd like to do, though, is call your attention to Fareed Zakaria on CNN this past Sunday ran an episode or made a statement about how he thought at this point in time he could see where on election day the president wins re-election, but that mail-in voting, which according to Zakaria and the polls he was citing, tend to be favored by Democratic voters. We may not really know the outcome of the race until several weeks after all of those mail-in physical ballots can be tabulated. Now, I know in 2000, you had a particular role on behalf of then candidate George W. Bush down in Florida. So I was wondering if you could blend your experience with the Bush campaign in 2000 and Florida in particular with mail-in voting here in 2020. What do you think about that, Governor?
Well, thank you, Robert. I think Zakaria's analysis sadly might be correct. And I think it would be very unfortunate for the country if we don't know the outcome for weeks. We saw that 2 years ago in California where they had mail-in ballots. And 4 Republican candidates for Congress who won on election night with fairly large majorities a week later were determined to have lost because of those mail-in ballots. Each state has different.
Well, excuse me, wasn't that the case in California?
That
Virtually all of the California Republican candidates won at the ballot box, but with mail-in voting and absentee voting, the complexion of those races changed.
That's right. A week later, 4 who had apparently won on election night actually ended up losing when all the ballots were counted. I fear that could well be the outcome again this year. I hope not, because I think it'll just be very disruptive to people's confidence in our democracy. And I think that is absolutely essential. But you refer back to 2000, and I remember I'd worked for then candidate Bush very hard after the election was taking a break in Florida, and I get a call from Karl Rove, and he goes, "Where are you?" I go, "I'm in Palm Beach." He goes, "Good, get over to West Palm right away. They're trying to steal the election." And so I spent the next week in the room counting the ballots with as Bush's observer, and Al Gore had his observer, and then there were the election commissioners actually making the determination as to who to count the ballot for. And it was the most arbitrary, convoluted thing you could see happening. And I remember there were the three election commissioners. One was a partisan Democrat. It didn't matter what the ballot looked like. That person was going to say that ballot was clearly for Al Gore. One was a judge who was totally neutral and actually did the right thing and looked objectively to try to figure it out. And the third was the commissioner who had designed the so-called butterfly ballot, and she was so distraught over the negative publicity that she just went along with whatever the judge said. So ultimately, I think it was a fair recount. But what it points out to is when you have this post-election day flood of ballots, how are they going to be counted? Who's going to be doing the counting? How are we going to be sure that if, for example, Bush is ahead in Pennsylvania by 20,000 votes, those people in the room counting those ballots are going to not look to find 25,000 votes for Joe Biden? So I think that would be the worst possible outcome, because it will raise questions about the democratic process. I fear it could be an outcome. And I think it just points out that when you have this convoluted system of voting, I mentioned the election is 7 weeks from today. People in Pennsylvania can vote today, I believe. Yeah. And no debates, no knowledge of what's going to happen. And it just, to me, is a distortion of the democratic process that ultimately leads people to doubt the validity of that process.
Well, just to take the other side of this argument, why should we be so afraid of mail-in voting? We've had absentee voting since time immemorial. That seems to work well. Would you agree that it's relatively free from fraud? Why should mail-in voting be any different than that? And number one. And number two, why aren't we better prepared for this?
Robert, that is, I think, an absolutely critical question. All elements of that. First of all, absentee balloting does work extremely well. And the absentee ballot numbers are up astronomically across the country. And I think that's a good thing, because to get an absentee ballot, the voter has to apply for the election board to send that person a ballot, which they then fill out and send back. Mail-in ballots are totally different. That's where the Board of Elections sends a ballot to every registered voter. And we know there are more than, perhaps as many as 1 million, but certainly hundreds of thousands of people on the registration rolls who don't exist. They either moved or they died. And so we're going to be seeing hundreds of thousands of ballots mailed out to people who aren't there. And the question—
Why do those dead people tend to vote Democratic then? I mean, this goes back to 1960 in Cook County, doesn't it? Why is it that these outcomes, I think that's what you're inferring, they tend to favor Democrats over Republicans? And why is that?
Well, I think they do, which is why Republicans are opposed to it. One, everybody should be opposed to it, because it's just wrong to have people who don't exist, who moved, who died, have ballots cast in their name. It doesn't matter what party it is. So it shouldn't be a partisan issue. But the practical, and by the way, in 2016, there was a Republican campaign operative in North Carolina who was indicted and ultimately convicted of going around and getting paper ballots and bringing them in. So it's not a one-sided thing, but it's more likely to favor the Democrats because of the urban areas. I mean, I lived in an apartment house on the west side of Manhattan, which wasn't in the highest rent neighborhood back then. And you had your mailboxes, but you'd always have dozens of letters, mail, that was to someone who they didn't have a box for, and the mailman just left it on the table. And what's going to happen when there are hundreds of thousands of ballots mailed out in apartment houses where a significant percentage aren't there anymore, but the ballot is left? Can we be confident that those ballots are simply going to be discarded, or is somebody going to pick them up and fill them out? In 2016 as well, there was the big controversy in Georgia over the governor's race, where Stacey Abrams said, voter suppression, that's why she lost. Well, the fact of the matter is, Georgia law said after 10 years, you have to purge voting rolls of people who haven't voted once for local elections, state elections, president, or anything else from the voter rolls. So the Secretary of State purged, I think it was 200,000 or 300,000 names from the rolls. That was supposed to be voter suppression, but the people hadn't voted in 10 years. So that's just an example of the potential for fraud. I have enormous faith in the people of America that the vast majority will try to do the right thing. But if
Governor,
but all you need are a handful of people, operatives, who are so
Sure.
committed to go out there and gather up these unused votes that it could distort the process.
so to go back to something else you said that I think 2020 is the most unusual year of your life. So let's take it one step further. Let's say that the outcome of the election is unclear for several weeks into perhaps 2021. What happens then? What happens when we get to, what is it, January 21st, 2021, and it's still unclear? How does that all play out?
Boy, first of all, I pray that doesn't happen, although in this bizarre year it could happen. I mean, in 2000, we did have a delayed result because there was the recount in Florida, and it went 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 weeks before ultimately the Supreme Court ruled. And that was disheartening, but ultimately it was just one state, and it was essentially 1 or 2 counties over recounting a handful of ballots that actually existed. If it's a mess across the country this time, I can see that happening. And ultimately, it's up to Congress to seat and recognize the electors, and how that will be done. I don't know the fine details of it, but I'm sure ultimately it would not surprise me if this ends up again as in 2000 in the Supreme Court as to which electors should be seated from which state. I believe the Senate has the initial authority to do that, but certainly Congress or the Supreme Court would have oversight to make sure it had been done constitutionally. But you say, why aren't we better prepared? The Constitution specifically says election processes are the providence of the states. So the federal government has a very limited, almost non-existent role in the electoral processes, other than things like making sure the civil rights laws are upheld and things of that nature. So every state has a different system. Every state has a different process. Some are better prepared than others. I fear some are not as prepared as we would hope they would be.
Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot again. Who wins the election ultimately? How does this play out?
It comes down to the debates. If Joe Biden comes across in those debates as someone who is mentally acute, physically and mentally strong enough to do the job of president, which is an incredibly demanding job, and outlines positions that reject the radical left, which is where all the energy in the Democratic Party is now, I think he will still win a narrow victory. If, on the other hand, in the debates he appears confused or disorganized or somehow unwilling to disown the radical left, like the rioters and people who assaulted the cops in Compton, then he's going to lose. And now the third interesting question here is, what if he doesn't debate? I mean, Nancy Pelosi has said it, the New York Times, others have said it, that given how Trump's propensity for lying, Biden just shouldn't debate. I don't think what they're saying is that. I think what they're saying is we don't believe Joe Biden is capable of sitting an hour and a half and engaging in an unscripted back and forth in front of the American people. So what happens if they ultimately conclude that Biden shouldn't debate? Are the American people going to say, oh my goodness, this is a sign that he's really not up to the job and I have to rethink voting for him? Or are they just going to say, well, Trump is such a horrible guy, I understand? I don't know the answer to that, but it'll be interesting because if I'm a Democratic strategist, I have always known and respected and liked Joe Biden. I am concerned about his performance on the campaign trail over the course of the past 6 months. I am very concerned about it, about if he's up to the job and willing to stand up to the new left radicals in the Democratic Party. I would draw the conclusion, if he doesn't debate, that he's not up to the job. Others would, I'm sure, draw a different conclusion. So there's those three things. But I honestly think that's going to be the deciding factor, those debates.
Very interesting, very interesting. Let's move on for a second and talk a little bit about the House and the Senate here in 2020. We don't want to neglect the other branches of government. So what are you thinking with respect to the Senate?
You know, that's in New York City today, we see the great benefit of one-party government. And I say that very ironically because New York City is suffering. And I think we have an awful mayor, and I think we have awful governance. And it's in large part because it's a very one-party city. And when that happens, you empower the fringes because they win the primaries and there's no serious opposition. I fear one-party government in Washington. If Trump loses, I believe it'll be almost impossible for the Republicans to keep the U.S. Senate. Right now, the polls, the best analysis shows it 47 Democrats, 47 Republicans, 6 states up in the air. A number of those states, Trump should win, like Montana, Iowa, North Carolina. If he wins, that gives the Republican Senate candidate running very close races in those states the chance to win. If he loses, like North Carolina, if he loses Iowa, if he loses Maine badly, where Susan Collins is running for re-election, then the Democrats will, in my view, control the Senate and the House, as well as the presidency. It used to be people split their tickets more than they do now. Now we see a lot more partisan voting, where if you vote Trump president, you're likely to vote Republican Senate. If you vote Biden president, you're overwhelmingly likely to vote Democrat for Senate. So that's, I think a lot of it hinges on the presidency. I think it'll be almost impossible if Biden wins for the Republicans to hold the Senate.
Yeah, so how about the House?
The House is closer than people think. The Democrats have had a pretty secure majority for the last years, but a number of them are running for the first time for re-election in districts that Trump carried in 2016. And 2018 was a horrific year for Republicans all across the country, at every level, state level, local level, and certainly for Congress and the Senate. It's closer than people think because the Republicans are running, a lot of it comes down to the candidates. In the Senate, Chuck Schumer, to his credit, recruited very strong Democratic candidates in the races where they had a chance of picking up seats. Former governor in Montana, former governor in Colorado, Speaker of the House in Maine. He did a good job in recruiting. In the House, the Republicans have done a very good job in recruiting. They've recruited some excellent candidates to take on these first-term Democrats in what had been Trump's seats. They would have a decent shot, except that it's not so much a blue wave as a green wave. The Democratic House candidates are outspending the Republicans by a factor of more than 2 to 1 and more likely 3 or 4 to 1 in those key seats. They have the power of incumbency. Nancy Pelosi is a master at getting every nickel possible out of the system. And if it were even financially, I'd say the Republicans would have a 45% chance of flipping the House. Given the spending advantages the Democrats have in key races, I think it's more like there's a chance, but I think it's a 1 out of 3 chance they can win enough seats to win it back.
Very interesting. And what happens in this scenario? The president wins re-election. The Senate goes Democratic. The House remains Democratic. We have a truly divided government in Washington. How does the president govern under those set of circumstances?
Well, there's 2 options. One is I have a pen and a phone and I can do whatever I want by executive order, which is not, in my view, the right way to govern. Or there is to try to sit down and create a consensus. And I think, hopefully, if that is the outcome, the president and Congress and Pelosi and Schumer will understand, okay, the election's over, we got to get some things done here, and put aside the personal animosity and try to negotiate differences. Just, Robert, one thing that's so disappointing to me is the last effort at providing a Washington stimulus for the economy because of the COVID crisis. And the unwillingness to sit down and actually try to come to a compromise agreement, to me, is very unfortunate, particularly for the people who are unemployed and the small businesses that need help to stay alive. You would hope that cooler heads after the election would prevail, and Pelosi and Schumer would sit down and say, okay, he's here, he's got 4 years, we have to try to get things done. You would hope the president would say, I'll put aside the personal animosity. I'm supposed to be a deal maker. Now let's make some deals. But if that doesn't happen, we'll see what the president has done over the last 6 months, where he's used executive orders to enact a number of programs that he couldn't get through Congress.
And so if that were to happen, you had talked a little bit earlier about again, these are my words, not necessarily yours, but the growing, let's say, civil unrest around the country. Do you see that stoking that unrest even more? That type of style of government?
I think the greatest risk for that is uncertainty in the outcome of the election. If the president, whether it's Biden or Trump, is perceived as illegitimate, is perceived as having stolen the election, then I think it's going to have awful consequences for the country. If Trump wins and then governs by executive order, the Supreme Court can rein him in. Congress can rein him in. The Supreme Court can rein him in. And I don't see that as an excuse for civil disorder. You know, the president used executive powers to move money from the Defense Department to building his wall along the Mexican border. Whether or not that was politically popular, whether or not he had the executive authority to do it, it didn't create massive unrest. It happened, and it's over and done with. So I think the greater risk by far is the uncertainty leading to questioning the legitimacy of the winner, whoever wins the election.
Okay, fair enough. Earlier in your comments, you alluded to inept government locally, and I think you were very pointed in tagging the mayor, and I suspect along with the mayor, perhaps the governor of New York State. And I'm just curious on your view, because I know that while you were in office, you went to great lengths to operate in a fiscally responsible manner. That would be my, whether it was good or bad, that seemed to be the approach you took. That's been cast by the wayside, I think, in recent years. And my question to you then is, with people leaving New York State in record numbers, along with businesses, what are we to do?
You know, Robert, I'm really worried about the future of the city more so than at any time in my life. After September 11th, we had a hideous economic situation. Over 10 million square feet of office space destroyed, 20 million more square feet unoccupiable for an extended period of time. And the mantra was decentralized. Tourists have attacked New York. We can't have a concentration of global economic wealth in one narrow, small island. So we had to fight enormously hard to get that turned around. We had to fight to bring people back. Tourists wouldn't come to New York. They were afraid to come to New York. The theaters were empty. The restaurants were empty. And it wasn't because of COVID. It was because people were afraid and wouldn't come. I fear we now have a worse situation where people don't want to come because of COVID, but they're also hearing the horrific stories about crime. They're also seeing the examples of mentally ill people harassing people on the street. And are tourists going to come back to New York in the next 6 months? I hope so, but I don't think so. You mentioned people leaving. The economic climate in this city and state is dreadful. The tax burden is way too high, and people are finally getting to the point where they're saying, you know, I don't have to be in New York. The other major change is the whole paradigm of working remotely, like this conference being conducted remotely. You don't have to be in an office anymore, or you can be in an office and work through Zoom and occasionally get together. So a lot of companies and a lot of people are going to say, we don't have to pay massive rent in New York City. We don't have to deal with the hideous commute and the high taxes. We can live someplace else and still have a core operation in New York for when it's essential to get together. So, I mean, I go in every month. I'm going in again tomorrow. I'm in a 60-story office building on 6th Avenue. I've been in a number of times. I've never seen anyone. We're allowed to go into the building. We're allowed to work in the building. There's no one there. When you think about where we are, things have got to change. People look at the economic climate, and it's much more difficult and more expensive to be in New York. And is it worth paying the premium when you don't have the theaters, you don't have the restaurants, you don't have the
Yes.
colleagues and the attention? And then we have the other thing they look at is the social crime climate. And when you have this, the homeless and the crime and the civil unrest and the demonizing of the police, is this really what we want? New York is New York. It will come back, but the question is it going to be 3 months, 3 years, or 30 years? And that depends on leadership and the policies that are put in place at the highest level.
Yes. And I know you know this, but many members of this organization are involved in the alternative investment industries, private equity and hedge funds. And I can tell you that.
But not cows.
But not cows, right?
Not
yet. Not yet. I can tell you that many of these firms are looking to relocate. And a destination that seems to be quite popular these days is Florida. And that's unfortunate for New York City.
Florida has no income tax. Florida has no inheritance tax, no estate tax. And it's the same with Texas. Texas is booming. Florida is booming. And it's not just the weather. You know, it's
yes.
economic competitiveness. People are willing to pay a premium to be in New York. Given what they perceive New York to be now, they're not willing to pay as much of a premium. And given the economic conditions, they fear they're going to be asked to pay more. And when you have a leader like de Blasio saying, well, if the wealthy people leave, so what? Others will replace them. You know, you go to Palm Beach. I'm sure you do, and I do. I have dozens, literally, very successful friends who were New Yorkers. And now they pay no income tax, and their philanthropy and their occupations are helping Florida. And that's a most unfortunate thing for New York.
Okay, and I'm playing with the screen here because we have a slew of questions coming in. So one question is, what role must the federal government play in the recovery of New York City? And that comes in from BJ Belloc.
I think that's a very good question, and I think the answer is it should play a role. After September 11th, we were able to convince Congress and President Bush that the attacks on New York were really an attack on America, and we needed to have help. And the federal government provided assistance, not to the state government, not to the local governments, but to rebuild the infrastructure, the MTA, the subways, the PATH trains from New Jersey, and to help us create an incentive package for the private sector to come back. And I think it's appropriate for the federal government to do that this time as well. And hopefully they will. There's a big difference between understanding that because of the COVID crisis, ridership on the MTA has plummeted and the revenue has gone down, and it would be appropriate for the federal government here and in other places where there are similar circumstances to provide assistance to help them get back on their feet. What I don't think would be appropriate is for states to come in and say, like Illinois, oh, our pension fund is only 20% funded, fill it up so that that's not a problem. Or we have this massive budget hole that existed before the COVID crisis, give us the money for that. I don't think the federal government should do that, but I do think there's an important role for the federal government to help communities and states like New York get back on their feet.
Thank you, Governor. Listen, you hit a hot point there. Underfunded pension funds. What happens with them?
You know, that's, I don't think the federal government should bail it out. And it's something that, again, it's a state and local decision. New York State's pension system has almost always been 100% funded. And it's a bipartisan recognition that we're not going to mess with it. It's sitting there, $140, $150 billion, ripe for the politicians to deal with. But in New York, that has never happened. In a state like Illinois and New Jersey, they haven't funded it. And I don't think the taxpayers of New York, through federal taxes, should be asked to bail out New Jersey's pension and Illinois' pension, where they have ignored the obligation for decades.
And by the way, that's the same argument that Republicans use against New York, isn't it? That they don't want to be in a position to have to bail out New York State. So you hear Mitch McConnell say that. Leader McConnell says that all the time. So that kind of cuts both ways then, right?
No, I think that's right. I don't think the federal government should bail out New York State, but I think they should help New York get back on its feet from things that are directly attributed to COVID, like the collapse in ridership on the MTA and certain other things that I think are appropriate for federal assistance.
Fair enough. Now, Governor, I have two questions coming in from Jane Joseph. Given the massive Trump tax cuts and COVID-related assistance programs, how much of a tax increase can we expect? And will future tax policy be more favorable to the middle and working classes?
I think that depends on the outcome of the election.
Okay.
The president, I think, is not going to raise taxes. I just don't see him doing it if he gets reelected. Biden has already outlined a tax plan that would raise the top rate back to the 39.6% it had been before the Trump tax rates. It would tax capital gains as ordinary income, meaning you would be paying the 39.6% on capital gains. It would raise the cap on corporations, the tax on corporations from 21 to 28. So, and there are other things like, is there going to be a carbon tax? Are there going to be other taxes that impact everyone? But certainly for corporations, for people who have capital gains, for people in the upper income brackets, they will pay higher taxes if Biden gets elected.
Okay.
That's
You've made a couple of references earlier on to the role of the Supreme Court, which I think begs the question, given the possibility of the vacancy of Justice Ginsburg's seat, what are the implications for healthcare and reproductive freedoms? And this question comes from Jane Joseph. Again, given the possibility of a vacancy in the Ginsburg seat and the implications for healthcare and reproductive freedoms, what do you think about that?
I think the implications are, in my view, very small. I don't think Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned. I think whether or not Justice Ginsburg is replaced by a conservative, I just don't see a majority of the justices overturning it. Chief Justice Roberts, among others, is a great believer in stare decisis, that once something is decided, you need to depend
let it stand
on it, let it stand, because people are depending on that law. And I would think the likelihood is very strong that at least 5 would uphold that. On healthcare, I don't see Obamacare itself being overturned. The one thing that is questionable was Roberts had the key vote saying that the fines were a tax. That one element could be challenged, but I don't think that would undo the entire law.
Okay. So let's move on in the remaining time that we have, Governor, and let's talk a little bit about trade. You know, we were talking, or you were talking a moment ago about Florida and Texas. Texas in particular being a major state when it comes to import and export for goods and services here in the U.S. What do you think about the president's restructuring of NAFTA and his whole approach to trade so far? TPP, NAFTA, China, et cetera.
Well, on NAFTA, I think he did the right thing in renegotiating it. It had some loopholes, you know, like we can import cars that are made in Mexico, but they only had to have a very small percentage made in Mexico. It could all be made in China and then assembled in Mexico and imported as a Mexican car. So things like that needed to be changed and have been changed. And I think even Joe Biden has acknowledged that the new agreement with Canada and Mexico is better than NAFTA had been. With the TPP, I was disappointed the president pulled out of that. Not because I think it was a perfect law, but I think geopolitically and strategically, linking Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, and other strategic countries near China in a closer relationship with the United States had enormous geopolitical value, and the economic concerns could have been tweaked and negotiated in a way that would have protected American industry. The other big thing is China. And this is one thing I think President Trump has gotten right, and he deserves credit for. The Republicans and the Democrats both felt, open trade essentially with China. China will evolve in a democratic way. That was the hope of everyone. It's now plain that China is not evolving in a democratic way. In fact, it's regressing to a very totalitarian state. And it's also clear that they have been willing to steal intellectual property without any concerns of being caught at all, and also engage in unfair trade practices. So I think his tariffs against China are the right move. I would hope that Vice President Biden, if he wins, will continue to be aggressive and standing up to trade against China. And this is one of the few areas where there's actually bipartisan agreement. And
so here's a question from the audience. During the COVID crisis, there has been a lot of back and forth between the president and the governors regarding appropriate measures. We're talking about equipment, respirators, et cetera. As a former governor, where do you see the lines of delineation?
The main response is at the governor's level. There is no question about it. It was the case on September 11th. The main was the city, because the city was the one that had the resources to deal with it, but the ultimate power rested with the governor. And as we see with the states across the country now, the decisions on closings and reopenings and what can be allowed and what can't be allowed are all being made at the governor's level, and that's as they should be. But what has been missing has been federal leadership and coordination. I mean, I think the federal government should every week be putting out best practices to help guide the governors. I think the federal government should be gathering data and showing that data to the governors as to what whether you can have indoor dining under certain circumstances, whether people can go back to school. So the federal government's role is to coordinate and guide. And I think there's been some of that, but not nearly enough. The governors run the show, make the decisions, but certainly also when it comes to things like PPE and ventilators and things of that nature, then there's an enormous role for the federal government, again, not to run things, but to be the coordinator and the dispenser and to help. And I think on the information sharing and the guidance to the governors on an ongoing basis, I don't think that has been at all what it should be. But on the emergency response, things like sending the U.S. Comfort with retrofitted for COVID-19 beds to New York Harbor and retrofitting the Javits Center so that it had 1,200 COVID-ready beds. Those were all appropriate things, responses by the federal government, but those were in response to a request from the governors. So that's the way it works. The governors control it. The governors request from the federal government whatever assistance they don't have that the federal government can help them with. But the federal government should do a far better job in coordinating the best data, information, and the best practices to do things like reopen schools.
Okay. And I know over the years you have had an abiding interest in climate change and the environment. And a question that's coming in from the audience here from Ali Taco, the Paris Accord. Should we have left the Paris Accord? And what's the way forward?
This has been an issue that I've been concerned about for a long time. And I started out back in 2005. We created the first regional greenhouse gas initiative to have a cap and trade program for CO2 emissions, and it's still in effect today. But I fear right now it has become like everything else, so ideologically polarized, that it's not aimed so much at solving the problem as gaining political points. I'm opposed to a carbon tax. It would have terrible repercussions in areas like the Northeast, where a lot of people heat their homes with fuel. Rural areas where you don't have a subway or a bus. You have to drive a long distance to get to work or to even get groceries. And I think it would have disproportionate impacts. The other thing that concerns me is unilateral action by the United States is not going to solve the problem. This is a global issue. Today, the United States has less than 240 coal-fired power plants out of the more than 5,000 that are on the earth. If we shut down every one tomorrow, there'd still be more next year because of what China and India are doing. So I think the best solution is for us to continue to innovate and invest in technology. Something that we can do as Americans that will help make the air cleaner here, but that we can export to the globe. There are a lot of technologies out there that are CO2 negative, carbon-coated fibers that can take CO2 from the atmosphere, reforesting, planting a trillion trees, not an impossibility. You reforest the sub-Saharan Sahel, that will absorb virtually all the CO2 that humans have created since 1910. The list of technologies, fusion power, hydrogen power for transportation, develop these and we will solve the problem. We will help the American economy grow as opposed to hindering the American economy with regulations, and export that technology to places like India and China so that it becomes a global solution.
So that's a very interesting perspective on what the future might have in store. But let's talk a little bit about what's going on right now out in California and Oregon with those horrific fires. And I know that there seems to be some debate as to whether this is related to climate change or whether it has to do with improper management of our forests. What do you think?
As is often the case, I think it's both. I think you do have to have appropriate management of forests. When you allow the fuel load to just build up for decades and decades, trees falling down, branches coming down, leaves coming down, and you develop this massive fuel load on the ground and you get the spark, you're not just going to have a fire, you're going to have a conflagration like we're seeing in California in the West right now. So that's part of it. But I also believe that part of it is that the West Coast is having a drought. Now, to what extent it is drier because of climate, I don't know. But the one thing I do think is that when we're changing the makeup of the atmosphere and without having certainty as to the consequences, the best thing we can do is stop changing the makeup of the atmosphere. Stop adding CO2 when there's the real potential of it causing global warming that creates things like droughts on the West Coast. So I think you need to do it, approach it in actually three ways. One is deal with the overload in the forests through better forest management, invest in the technology and develop the technology so we can stop emitting CO2 into the atmosphere with unknown consequences and perhaps very severe consequences. But the third in California is they never invested in their power grid. And the fires, in a number of instances, were started by a power grid that was overstressed, old, not taken care of, and it would cause sparks and flames that set everything on fire. It's great to talk about solar and wind and all the new technologies to generate clean power, and that's positive. But you cannot cease investing in the traditional transmission grid, or you're going to have things like what happened in California. So manage the forest better. Do everything technologically and innovatively in our power to reduce CO2 and reverse CO2 in the atmosphere, but also make sure that things like your electric grid are not a part of the problem.
You know, Governor, recently you and I had an opportunity to chat about your views on some of the solutions going forward, and I believe you made a statement to me about hydrocarbons and what society's requirement for them might be in the coming years. And I was wondering maybe if you'd spend a moment talking a little bit about alternative energy solutions and how imminent they might be, how realistic, how practical they are, how cost effective they might be in the coming years.
You know, Robert, I hope I haven't come across as a pessimist because I'm very much of an optimist. And this is one of the areas where I am an optimist. I'm an optimist in so many areas, and in medical breakthroughs. We're going to have cures for cancers and Alzheimer's. We're going to have age extending protocols and everything. And I think it's going to be sooner rather than later because of the tremendous innovative nature of the American entrepreneurial spirit and our academic capabilities. And I think it's the same thing with hydrocarbons and energy. Fusion power is the ultimate solution. It's the power of the sun, and it generates enormous quantities of energy. It's uncontrollable right now, which is why we have hydrogen bombs. But there's enormous progress being made to harness that as a virtually unlimited source of clean power. In the near term, we have electric cars powered by batteries that are charged. The batteries are going to get better. But I think at some point we're going to have hydrogen cars. I drove a hydrogen car 20 years ago that one of the Japanese car makers had. And I asked them about it and then I asked the question, how much does it cost? And the answer was $1 million. So you're not going to see them on the streets for a while.
Not anytime soon.
$1 million for a little sedan. But the point is that the technology is being developed. And as with everything, as you become more accustomed and as the demand and the knowledge grows, it will become closer to grid parity. And that's the key, is to have grid parity. Right now, solar power is very close to grid parity, meaning it doesn't cost any more to switch from fossil fuels to solar. We're working with a company that has a nano coating that raises the effectiveness of solar panels from 16 to 18% to 48%. And it works. It's just too expensive. And again, they're working on ways to lower the cost. And if that happens, solar will become cheaper than hydrocarbons. Right now, I'm working on a project to bring clean hydropower from Quebec. Quebec has enormous extra hydro resources going into into Labrador and the Arctic that they can't use in the summer months. It's interesting, Canada's peak load are in the winter when they have to heat. New York's peak load is in the summer when we have to cool. And we're working on a transmission line to bring that clean power from Quebec into New York City, reducing our need for carbon and fossil fuels here. So this is one of the many areas. I'm very much an optimist. I think within a decade, we're going to see incredible sources of renewable and clean energy that are if certainly not more expensive and perhaps even less expensive than today.
Well, Governor, it sounds all very exciting. And in our remaining few moments, I'd like to ask you some questions or just get your view in general on two topics that I know are of great interest to you. One being high-speed rail, and the second being autonomous vehicles, which I just have to tell you, I would never get into a driverless car. I guess that's for a new generation, but what do you think about high-speed rail and autonomous vehicles?
Well, high-speed rail, it's really interesting because we have the fiasco of California. And there they have wasted hundreds of millions of dollars on a relatively high-speed, 180-mile-an-hour train from nowhere to nowhere. And ultimately, I think they've just pulled the plug on it and concluded it was a political statement as opposed to an economic and technology-based effort. And that has put a hole in the whole concept of high-speed rail. But it exists all over the world. It exists in Europe. It exists in China. And I've ridden the Ultimate, which is the maglev train in Japan. It goes 320 miles an hour. Millions have ridden it. It's existing technology. Yes. The Japanese want to bring that to America. One of the projects I'm working on now is that project from Washington, D.C. to Midtown Manhattan, 55 minutes. Downtown Philadelphia, Midtown Manhattan, 24 minutes. And this is not pie in the sky. This is technology that millions have ridden. And there's
who's doing this? Governor, who's behind this?
Private group that we have that is working on this with the Japanese government and with the Japanese rail company that has the technology. And we have made enormous progress. The problem is the federal bureaucracy. We have been working to get an environmental impact done now, I think, for 8 years. And spent a fortune on it. There's no real opposition. It's not like we're going through wetlands or condemning this or doing something else, but it's just the inability of the bureaucracy in Washington. And it doesn't matter if it was under Obama or Trump, we get the same result, just, it's going to take 3 more months. So I'm very optimistic this will happen. And I think it'll be a harbinger of successful high-speed rail projects across the country. They have to work economically. There's no better place. Sacramento to Bakersfield doesn't work economically for a massive rail investment. Washington, D.C. through Philadelphia to New York City does work. And that's what.
Well, the Northeast Corridor, I think,
yes,
clamors for it, no question. So, Governor, unfortunately, I think we're about out of time. And I just want to say thank you for joining us. I know Ali has gotten back on the line. So, hello, Ali. Ally?
Hi, everybody. I think I popped in a few times inadvertently, but Governor Pataki, thank you so much for sharing your perspective on the current political landscape, clean energy, the environment. It was all food for thought for us, and I know we all appreciate hearing your perspectives. For those of you in the audience, our next roundtable is scheduled to be October 13th at 1 p.m. It's entitled China, Theft, Subversion, and Election Interference, and it will feature renowned lawyer, author, and columnist Gordon Chang. Please be on the lookout for our next monthly call, and we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Stay safe, healthy, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you again, Governor Pataki.